Before they go to write out their paper, they're going to talk, 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 talk until it sounds fluent, and then you'll tell them to write. So you'll walk around the room, listen to students reading their organizers. When they sound fluent, then you tell those specific children that sound fluent to go ahead and write. Children that are having a little more difficulty, you can pull in a small group and do more of the oral language practice and help them with their writing. This is a great way to differentiate your students as well. So we'll go back and we'll practice this one time. The frightened child screamed when he saw a long snake in the grass. Suddenly, the angry snake hissed and then rattled his tail. He started waving his arms and jumping up and down when he heard that snake's noises. Quickly, the boy ran home as fast as lightning. In the end, he felt lucky because he had a safe home to go to when he felt scared. We just finished planning a story for stage 2. If you look on page 145, you'll see some other stories that students had planned. Here was a kinder story about a dog and then the kinder writing. And then over here was a first grade story where they planned the story and then they wrote it out. Just a reminder to our kinder teachers, these narrative writing steps, you are drawing the organizer and your teacher write to model how you're thinking and the steps of how to write a narrative. You are also going to be recording and making the organizer for the students when you and they together are going to be planning a story for interactive writing. When they're in small group, these are the same exact steps that you're using. This was actually a small group writing for a child at the beginner level who was writing their own story. And what happened was the teacher just had a long sheet of paper, and every time the student was planning a new part of the story, the teacher drew on the organizer. So that way the student went back, referred to it, and then wrote out their story on lined paper. This first grader was in a whole group lesson where the class and that student were together coming up with the story, recording it on their organizer, orally rehearsing it, and writing it down. Eventually, in these whole group lessons, kids learn the steps of how to fill in this organizer. Once they learn the steps, they can write their own story. So then I put students who know the steps during these writing lessons in partners. Not all my students will go in partners at first. I'll have kids and partners who together will be using the steps. They both will have their own organizer, and together they're following the steps to make their own story. And then finally orally rehearsing it and writing it out. I, during this writing time, while they're in partners, will be still working with my lower kids who together we will be using the steps to write a story together. I can't release them in partners because they don't have the steps down yet. So you need many rehearsals of these steps where you write many stories. After a while, maybe my mediums have the steps down and I put them in partners. And then finally my lows will be in partners. And then I can start having my highs and mediums just write the stories on their own following the steps. And my goal is for every student to be independently writing their narratives, planning out their organizers using the steps, and then writing on their own. Hence, we should eventually have every student planning and talking using the steps to plan their narrative, and then adding the punctuation and also talking and writing as they write out their story from their planner. It's critical. Don't have a quiet room. Once they have that narrative here on their organizer, you want to make sure that they talk, 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 write. Go back, reread your organizer, reread your writing, and then continue writing. You always want children to read the organizer and continue with the talking. So they use the organizer and reread their writing so it makes sense. Okay, that's stage 2. Now, practice the stage 2 steps on your own and see if you can write a story. Please turn to page 145. After walking you through stage 2 narrative writing and all the steps and forming a story together, what I want to do is I want to review in detail everything you need to know about this stage. So, if you could take some notes, let's say that this is the long sheet of paper. So the long sheet of white legal size paper that you gave to students. Remember, fold the top part so that when they start the organizer, they have that long line and all they have to do is make the little line in the middle for their story opening boxes. Now let me draw over here. On our organizer, all the different parts are, the top part was the 2 boxes, the story opening. In these 2 boxes, the children had to decide on a character in this first box. We had in this box the setting, but the setting was just to help figure out the rest of the sentence. We have the setting just so that the children are forming their ideas to make sense. They have to have the character somewhere, and it has to be a time, so we have to put the setting in there. It doesn't mean we need to include it in that starting sentence because these are beginner writers. They're at that beginning level. So we have our character. Then our second box here was the action. After we finished that, we went back and we added our capitals where we wrote out the first word in our sentence, whatever it was, and we made sure that we capitalized it and we put a period here. So that was absolutely critical. So when the children go to write, they can go back to this organizer to remember where their capitals and stops are. Now we have our beginning sentence for our story opening. The next teaching point is you're going to go to the actions, actions, actions. You don't know how many actions are going to be in a story. So let's pretend a child has filled in the top 2 boxes. They're going to keep adding action boxes. You're not going to say, boys and girls, you need to have 2 or 3 action boxes. You're going to make the action boxes so that it makes sense in the story. We want to eliminate telling children you need 3 sentences, 4 sentences. That only gives us stilted writing. When we focus on the story, you'll find they'll write many more sentences because they're focusing on what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. So we have our action boxes and we just keep adding them. The point about the action boxes, your major teaching points are going to be this. First, you have to have them sequence. So they have to be able to say what happened next, and then using the after a while words and the previous action. So if you look over here on page 146, we have for the kindergartners, they had a dog and the dog ran underneath a tree. Then you want to say, what happened next after he ran under the tree? Over here with the first graders, they had a bear who saw a bush shaking. So we want to say, what happened next after he saw the bush shake or while he saw the bush shake? Whichever one would make sense in the story. So we want to sequence. That's critical. Once we sequence, then we want to get to the next idea. We want a good idea. We don't want children worrying about forming a sentence and saying the idea at the same time. That's why you end up having kids freezing because they're coming up with an idea and how to say it. Only focus on the idea. Talk about the idea. What do we do once we have the idea? Then they're going to draw a picture of that idea. Once they draw the picture, so notice over here in the kinder, they drew a picture for the next idea. In the first grade, they drew a picture for the next idea. So they sequenced, thought of the idea, drew it. Then you go back and you reread the whole organizer. That's critical because what happens is students are rehearsing what they've practiced beforehand, and they could also revise those previous sentences, as well as you need the previous sentence, just like any writer would need previous sentences, to go back, reread in order to form a new sentence. When they go to form a new sentence, you want to make sure that you are not telling them the sentence. You are only asking them the questions they need to eventually ask themselves to form a sentence. And that is, who is doing the action? You're going back and you're pointing to the picture that they just drew. So over here you would say, who's doing the action in this box? The dog. And then you're going to say, action. What is the dog doing? So now you want to ask, what's the dog doing? And then they put the whole thing together. You're not telling the sentence, you're asking the questions. Then the children will answer those questions in order to form that new sentence. If they are really able to form that sentence and they can hold on to it, they have control, then go back and add a transition, which right behind me, I have some transitions on a transition wall. So I could go back and if I was working with youngsters who are just beginning to write, I could just orally say to the children, oh, we could say this suddenly, we could say after a while or soon. I could just give them ideas and then they choose the one they want or we choose one. And we write it on, notice up here, the transition line. We would write our transition. So over here on my chart, I want to show you how if students have control over their sentences and they also can add transitions, then you could orally just give them ideas, or you could refer to your transition wall. So over here I have my terrific transition walls. I categorized it by transitions that work really well for narratives, and that is our when transitions. Many times in stories, when you go to the next action, it could be that the time has gone by or it happened really quickly, so there was a very short period of time. You need to let the reader know about the time. That's what's going to get you to the next sentence. Or maybe a location has changed. Or maybe you just as the reader need to know that up in the sky or down below or off in the distance. You need to have a location. Sometimes sound effects works where there's some sort of sound effect in the next action so they can begin their sentence with that sound effect. There's other categories that you could add also, like emotion words. Upset and perplexed, he walked in the room knowing he would not understand what was going on. So what happens? You're revealing how the character feels, upset and perplexed. That could be another category. You could have different emotion words there for them to start their sentences. Sometimes you could start your sentences with how, a how category. How is that action happening? Suddenly, quickly, quietly, slowly. You could have those adverbs. I showed 3 up here, and I have different transitions. Where do I get these transitions? We pull them from our movie scripts, or the focus story, whatever story you have been working on in your comprehension. You could go back after you've read the story many times and find what transitions the author used. And then the kids could hunt for those transitions and post them up on the transition wall. That's another way for students to become aware of an author's transitions when they read their own stories, as well as having a way to fill in this chart. I will warn you, if you start with a chart filled with transition words and the kids have not used it in their writing or have not seen those words in reading or they have not used them orally,